Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining at this busy end of the semester. And thanks for the committee for all of their coordination for this really successful virtual seminar series. So my name is Kelly Kibler, and I am an assistant professor of water resources engineering in the Civil, Environmental, and Construction Department. I'm also faculty of UCF's National Center for Integrated Coastal Research, or UCF Coastal. So this is the center that's grown out of the coastal cluster, and a faculty fellow of UCF's Center for Global Economic and Environmental Opportunity. So I got my PhD in water resources engineering from Oregon State University, and then accepted a position with the United Nations Environmental, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, that most of you probably know as UNESCO, and worked for them for a few years in Tokyo before coming to join the UCF faculty in 2015. So in terms of teaching at the graduate level, I teach a course called Ecohydraulics that I developed based on my research program, Open Channel Hydraulics and Water Policy Planning and Governance. At undergrad, I teach environmental fluid mechanics, hydrology, and directed research. That's the class that semester by semester is always on my schedule because I mentor a lot of undergraduates in research. So you can see by my student numbers below, 36 undergraduate research assistants have come through my lab. I have 9 currently. So that's a big part of kind of my teaching and mentoring integration with research. My research, I'm the founder of the UCF Ecohydraulics lab. I'll talk to you a lot about what ecohydraulics is, but I'll take a few minutes just to brag about some of our achievements. I've brought in about $3.8 million of external funding, of about 1.5 million or more is my share. And I've brought in funding from a variety of different funding sources. So at the national level, received awards from the National Science Foundation, from the CBET Program and Engineering Directorate, the Coupled Human Natural Systems Program, and as well as a career award in the Geomorphology and Land Use Dynamics Program. I've been funded by the EPA's National Estuaries Program, by the NOAA Ecosystem Effects of Sea Level Rise Program, and at the state level, the Florida Departments of Environmental Protection and Transportation. I'm a recipient of the UCF Reach for the Stars Award in 2020 and the RIA Award in 2021. I'm also an associate editor of one of the top water resources journals, so Journal of Hydrology, and hold leadership positions in national level organizations at the American Society of Civil Engineering. Okay, so a bit about my research. My research topic is called ecohydraulics. And ecohydraulics is this integrated study of coupled physical and biological variables in aquatic ecosystems. And so it's really well established within water resources engineering that hydrology and hydrodynamics are driving forces for mass transport mechanics within fluvial systems. So if I were to draw arrows on this diagram between the hydrology, hydrodynamics boxes and the mass transport box, that would be a really well established research area within water resources engineering. So ecohydraulics is a little bit different in that the system biota, so the plants and the animals that make up the aquatic ecosystem, are really at the front and the center of these interactions. And ecohydraulics study is really timely and important right now because some of the most pressing management questions in water resources engineering and in ecosystem management, especially facing climate change, just cannot be answered adequately without considering the full complexity of natural aquatic ecosystems, including those really complex and coupled processes. So here I have an example for you. So most of us with engineering training, maybe in fluid mechanics, have learned about drag coefficients, and usually in the context of really simplified geometries like flow over a smooth flat plate or flow around one smooth regular cylinder. So how do we come up with a drag coefficient parameterization of something that looks like these two examples that you would see in a natural aquatic ecosystem in Florida? So on the left-hand side, we've got canopies of oyster that you would see in the oyster reef. On the right-hand side, canopies of mangrove forest. And you can see both of them are very structurally complex 3D geometries. So parameterization of something like a drag coefficient in something that looks like this is really important to get an accurate representation of flow resistance in modeling that we would use for something like flood risk analysis or the prediction of a storm surge. And so for example, here we've estimated drag coefficients in these complex geometries at Reynolds numbers of about 10 to the 4th. So where, when, and how do you do ecohydraulics research? I've put together just kind of a gallery of slides of my lab doing ecohydraulics research. The where part is usually we are not inside of a lab. We're usually outside. So it's really difficult for us to represent truly the complexity of natural aquatic ecosystems in a lab. So while we do some lab study and numerical study, we always have a component of field work. So usually we're out in water, surrounded by plants and animals, maybe at weird times of the day or night, because we have to be at the right place at the right time to catch the right conditions that we are looking for. We have to dress for the occasion, and we're usually highly accessorized. We have to schlep tons of gear out into the wilderness and try to make sensors that may have been designed for lab work outside of the lab. So here's a few pictures of what's working inside at our outside research facility at our lab, and then on oyster reefs. Okay, so I'm going to share a couple of projects with you, and the first I'd like to share is called Developing a Shoreline Restoration Suitability Model for North Indian River and Mosquito Lagoon. So this project was funded by the National Estuaries Program, and my co-PIs in this work are Dr. Melinda Donnelly and Dr. Linda Walters from the UCF Biology Department, and Annie Roddenberry from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. And so the motivation for this project is to improve the design of natural and nature-based features for climate resistance. And the green infrastructure that we focused on in this project is for the purpose of bank stabilization. Shorelines are really essential to the health of our aquatic ecosystems. And when we build gray infrastructure like typical revetments or seawalls along our shorelines, it's a really great way to degrade our aquatic ecosystems and then start to see some of the problems like poor water quality, algal blooms, lack of biodiversity. And then ironically, these seawalls do tend to actually, in the long term, promote erosion and bank retreat. That's kind of the opposite of what they were intended to do, especially as sea levels are rising. So these infrastructure designs that integrate native species as green materials to stabilize banks are really kind of a hot topic right now. A lot of people want to do it, but the design of green infrastructure can be really tricky. So many restoration and green infrastructure projects fail because there hasn't been adequate consideration of site hydrodynamics and the hydrodynamic tolerances of the species that are going to be used. So this project elucidated a key piece of scientific knowledge that is needed to do green infrastructure better in Florida. We found the hydrodynamic habitat thresholds at which mangrove vegetation are excluded from a site. And we accomplished this as a combined numerical and field study. So in this first figure over on the left-hand panel, what we can see here is hydrodynamic magnitude that has been plotted opposite of its frequency. And then these red and blue boxes are parameterizations of sites that either have mangrove vegetation, the blue boxes, or do not, the red boxes. So you can see that consistently these blue boxes are a little bit below the red boxes and that the separation grows as the magnitude grows. What this indicates is that the mangrove have a preferred habitat that they like to inhabit, and when the site conditions become too stressful for them, they're excluded. So if we take one particular parameterization, so over a little bit to the right, I'm showing the 80th percentile wave height at the site, we can then start to elucidate exactly what is that threshold, where does it occur, and then we can start to make probabilistic assessments of how likely is it that a mangrove growing on a site with a particular hydrodynamic signature is going to persist in the long term. So this new scientific knowledge is really exciting, and it's led to several journal publications that I think are going to be pretty high impact because it's the first time that anybody has done this. But the project outcome that I am most excited about is that we were able to take this new scientific knowledge that we created and turned it into a tool that managers can use to actually do green infrastructure design at the site scale. So this is a kind of the panel on the left at the bottom right is showing a two-step process how this information can be used in design. One, by isolating what are kind of the most high priority sites within an area that need to be stabilized. And then on the other hand, once we've identified a high priority site, is it an appropriate design to include mangrove? Do we have to include a hybrid design? Or is it likely that mangrove will long-term persist at that site? So the next project that I want to introduce is called the Innovative and Integrative Bmps, or Best Management Practices for Surface and Groundwater Protection. So this project was funded by FDOT, and my co-PIs are my colleagues in CECE, Dr. Chang and Dr. Wang. This was a multi-pronged project that is aiming to develop novel methods for reducing nutrient loads in roadway runoff before it can enter surface and groundwater resources. And the data that I'm showing here come from a series of lab experiments that are testing the performance and design criteria for what you can think of as a self-filtering roadway. So we tested 2 full-scale physical models, one with and one without a novel vegetated filter strip containing engineered infiltration media that is designed to sequester nutrients. And so these data are means across about 60 different individual experiments. And what we found is that the inclusion of this engineered infiltration media led to a statistically significant removal of nitrogen through denitrification as compared to the control. So first of all, we're able to inform FDOT that this is a reasonable technology to try to develop as a best management practice, but we also are able to inform at the scale of design. So we didn't see these great beneficial impacts in a filter width of 3 meters. We had to get to a filter width of 6 meters before we saw these strong benefits. So based on that information, you can start to put together cost analyses for how much it costs to build something like this, how much land is needed, et cetera. So the last project I want to talk about is my NSF career project, the influence of turbulence to mass transport in complex aquatic habitats. So here I'm using coupled laboratory and field experiments to document the influence of canopy scale turbulence to sediment suspension and transport. And so we're doing a comparison of mechanisms within varied natural living canopies. So for instance, submerged flexible canopies like you would see in seagrasses, emergent rigid canopies like mangrove, and submerged rigid canopies of oyster. And so here I've got some data and photos in the field of us doing laser scans of oyster reefs, which we can take that point cloud data and then derive a number of parameterizations of things like the oyster canopy roughness height, or the porosity, or the solid volume fraction, and we can see how it varies over the surface of the reef. And then on the upper right, we've got some hydrodynamic data on reefs of different qualities. And this project is very much still in its active phases. So instead of outcomes, I've got some of the educational goals, since this is a career proposal or a career award. So in terms of future work in the near term, for the next 2 years, I plan on finishing up my currently funded work. And then I have a few proposals that are currently under development or under contracting. In the long term, I see myself continuing to focus on this flow biota interaction question with applications to green infrastructure design. I would really like to lead a large interdisciplinary proposal, something like the NSF Dynamics of Social Ecological Systems program, perhaps. And as I've been watching all of these talks given by my colleagues, over the months of this series, I've become really interested in some of the collaborative potential of my colleagues who are doing data science. So things like areas of big data or machine learning could be really well applied to the types of data that we collect. And I think that my colleagues who are doing virtual reality are doing amazing work, and maybe we could have some collaboration potential, for instance, taking some of these point clouds of natural ecosystems and trying to make some experiences through virtual reality by which we can bring people to these sites who maybe wouldn't find them accessible otherwise. So with that, I'm going to just say thank you to all of my current and past lab members, my collaborators and funding agencies. And if there's time, I'm happy to take some questions.